Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Gentleman's Magazine from May 1800. And this article is entitled, Lines Spoken by Children Once Deaf and Dumb. I found that very interesting because teaching the deaf to speak is very difficult if they're truly deaf. If they're hard of hearing, then it's a different thing. But especially back then, before they had hearing aids, before they had cochlear implants, it's very difficult to teach someone to speak if they can't hear you, because they also can't hear themselves, However, it is not impossible. It has been done, and many people who are deaf or identify as deaf because they're very, very hard of hearing is possible, and it is something that happens today. It is much more common today than it was then, however. So I'm very interested to see how they did it and how they were able to help those who cannot hear to learn to speak. So I found that very interesting. I will apologize for the ableist language. It was part of the vernacular of the day to call someone who cannot speak, who is, I would say, mute today, I would call them dumb. That is the word that they used at the time, and it's just, you can't really erase the past now, can we? Okay, let's take a look. Mr. Urban, May 12. May I request the insertion of the included lines in some corner of your useful and widely circulating publication? Though in themselves trifling, they derive some importance from the circumstance of their having been audibly, I may say, feelingly and emphatically recited by several poor children, who were born deaf, and who, of course, remained dumb till taught to speak. I make this request the less reluctantly as you have already shewn your promptitude in serving the cause of the indigent, deaf, and dumb. If I mistake not, your pages contain the first public hints of instituting an asylum in this country for their relief. This asylum is situated in the Grange Road, Bermondsey, in the county of Surrey, and it may be gratifying to you felt as well as many of your readers to be informed that success has hitherto attended the undertaking, and that many human beings are by it raised from a state of seclusion and uselessness to the condition of social and intelligent creatures whose existence may henceforward be a blessing to themselves and a benefit to the Commonwealth. There are at this time 35 children under tuition. The number of applications for admission exceed 60, but the funds are yet inadequate to the reception of more than 5 or 6, in addition to the number admitted. Wow. Okay. Private benevolence has done much more than may still be expected from it, and let us hope that when private benevolence has done all in its power, legislative support will not be wanting to rescue so considerable a portion of the human race from a condition so affecting. Those who live at the end of the 19th century will perhaps wonder that there could have been a time since the civilization of mankind when the importance of relieving this class of I'm not sure what that says. Okay. Something, I don't know, was not understood. Undue radiance, that's all I can say. Although I'm sure that's not what it says. I don't know what it says. Okay, if you have an idea, write it in the comments below. W.J. is the author. And here are the lines spoken by some of the children educated at the Asylum for Deaf and Dumb Children at the anniversary of the patrons to that institution, held at London, April 25th. Once again, this is very poor quality. A lot of the words have been kind of rubbed to the point you can't read it anymore. The deaf and dumb, through Britain's isle, the beauty you dispense partake. Yours is the honor to have raised the first asylum for their sake. Nor think the objects of your care, in conscience of the good you give, we feel and know the happy truth that great's the blessing we receive. And could we open to your view the feelings of a mind oppressed, with anxious cares, with joys or woes, by dumbness cruelly suppressed, then would you highly prize with us the bliss by your asylum given, nor scorn the feeble voice that lisps our gratitude to you and heaven. Okay, it's a school for the deaf and dumb. For the deaf mute, right? I'm assuming that it's in sign language, which is great. I'm all for inclusive education. Absolutely, inclusive education is fantastic. Accommodating education is what I would call this. The fact that they are teaching the deaf to speak, yeah, that makes it easier to interact with speaking people, especially if they're able to read lips as well. However, that's not a 100% solution. They must be able to read and write 100%. They can do a lot of work by correspondence. I don't like that they called them useless. Yeah, they would otherwise be useless if not going to this special school. I also don't like that they call it an asylum. I don't know. Like, I think of it as asylum in this sense, of like an orphan asylum. I guess in this sense they were thinking of as like a boarding school. I don't know. I just don't really like the term. And I also am not super excited about the lines that they were taught to speak. All hail and praise our glorious school. You know, like, wow, really? You know? But I will do a quick fact check on what was the first school for the deaf in the world. Yeah, it was not in Great Britain. Here we go. The first school for the deaf was established in France during the 18th century in 1771 by Charles Michel de L'Épée. L'Épée was the leader of establishing sign language for the deaf and is notable as the father of deaf education. However, that wasn't much earlier than this one that's mentioned. So, there's a Wikipedia article on schools for the deaf. So we are going to look at that. French Sign Language was developed and heavily influenced by L'Épée, working with deaf people who were already using their own home signs and combining those signs with new signs, which in this time period became known as L'Épée Sign Language. Makes sense. This French Sign Language became a major foundation and influence on all international sign language, especially on American Sign Language, which still retains much of the historical signs and signing grammar structure that originated from France. Wow, I did not know that. The American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut was the first school for the deaf established in the United States in 1817, which is after this article was written, which means the British were earlier than that, yeah? By Thomas Gallaudet, in collaboration with a deaf teacher also from France named Laurent Clerc, with support from the well-known Hartford Cogswell family. Alice Cogswell was the very first student to attend this school in 1817. Okay, that's slightly disappointing to me because I feel like this particular article is very American heavy. There's another article on education for the deaf, and I'm going to look up that really quick. Okay, deaf education is the education of students with any degree of hearing loss or deafness. This may involve, but does not always, individually planned, systematically monitored teaching methods, adaptive materials, accessible settings, and other interventions designed to help students achieve a higher level of self-sufficiency and success in the school and community than they would achieve in a typical classroom education. There are different language modalities used in educational settings where students get varied communication methods. A number of countries focus on training teachers to teach deaf students with a variety of approaches and have organizations to aid deaf students. Identifying deaf students, I don't understand why that's a thing. Like, I guess they have like, can you tell whether or not your child is deaf? You know, like, sure. Bilingual, bicultural education. Auditory, oral, auditory, verbal education. There we go. Auditory, verbal education, yeah? And oralism. Interesting. So in this philosophy, deafness is approached as a medical and not a cultural issue. There are two main educational philosophies for deaf and hard of hearing students based on the emphasis on auditory and verbal skills. The names of these philosophies are sometimes used interchangeably, but the methods primarily used in each philosophy are distinct. So oralism is a philosophy that education of deaf students should be conducted through and should promote the use of spoken language. That sounds like this institute had that philosophy, yeah? This philosophy utilizes a variety of approaches, including lip reading and speech training. Oralism was popularized in the late 1800s and largely enforced throughout Europe and North America, following the Second International Congress on Education for the Deaf in 1880. Oralism was established as an alternative to manual sign language education and stands in opposition to the use of sign language in the education of deaf and hard of hearing students. And then the second philosophy is called total communication, is an education philosophy for deaf and hard of hearing students, which encourages the use and combination of a variety of communication means, including listening, lip reading, speech, formal sign language, artificial sign systems, or manually coded language, gestures, finger spelling, and body language. The goal of the total communication philosophy is to optimize communication skills using a combination of means that are most effective for each individual child, leading to implementations of this philosophy that greatly differ from one to the next. Okay, that makes sense to me. I can understand how that would be difficult to standardize, because there's such a large combination of things that they use to communicate. I mean, it makes sense to me, yeah? But it sounds like this institution that they were mentioning is particularly oralism heavy, yes? Here we go. There's history. Great Britain. Okay, John Bulwer, who died in 1656, so this is more than a century, 150 years before this, an English physician, wrote 5 works on bodily communication, particularly gestures. He was the first person in England to propose educating deaf people, outlining plans for an academy in Philocophus, and the Dumb Man's Academy. Philocophus. The grandson of Sir John Popham, Alexander, was born in 1650. He was either deaf at birth or became so before acquiring speech. 2 eminent men came to his home in Littlecote House to teach him to talk. John Wallis, mathematician and cryptographer, and William Holder, music theorist. Why the flip did they pick a mathematician to teach him how to speak? I'm sorry, I studied math. I don't know how to teach someone to speak, okay? Why don't you try a speech therapist, why in the world would you go for the mathematician and cryptographer? I don't know. That's really weird to me. The first British school for teaching the deaf to speak and read was Thomas Braidwood's Academy for the Deaf and Dumb in Edinburgh, established during the 1760s. Oh, this isn't even the one they made. Yeah. The time of the Scottish Enlightenment, the school moved to London in 1783. I think that's the one they were mentioning. Braidwood used an early form of sign language, the combined system, forerunner of the British Sign Language. Under the management of Braidwood's nephew, the school expanded, encouraging the establishment of an institution for the instruction of the deaf and dumb in Edgbaston in 1814, and others in Liverpool, Doncaster, Edinburgh, Exeter, and Manchester, now the Cecil Trust. Britain's first free school for deaf pupils, the London Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, was set up in 1792. That's the one they're talking about. By 3 men, Henry Thornton, M.B., abolitionist and reformer, Reverend John Townsend, educator and independent minister, and Henry Cox Mason, rector of Bermondsey. Now, who was it that wrote this one? This was, as they gave their initials as W.J. So, is he on the list? No, he's not. Okay. Henry Thornton, John Townsend, or Henry Cox Mason. Nope. He's not on the list. W.J. But I'm pretty sure this is the one they're talking about, which is ironic because they said this is the first school for the deaf. And that's 100% incorrect, because there was one before that in Edinburgh and then moved to London in 1783. And this one was set up in 1792. So no, it wasn't the first. It was 9 years later, yeah? It's one of the first. I'll give them that, but I don't think that it was the first. Okay, let's read this part of the article and call it good for the day. In his ministerial relation, Mr. Townsend became acquainted with a lady whose son was deaf and dumb, who had been a pupil of Mr. Braidwood's almost 10 years. The youth evinced an intellectual capacity which caused delight and surprise to the good pastor, who was astonished at the facility and accuracy with which ideas were received and communicated. Oh my gosh, this is so ableist. It's so annoying. He couldn't possibly be smart because he's deaf, I can't believe he's so intelligent. Right, because deafness has anything to do with intelligence. Gosh, it's so annoying. I'm sorry. It's more than annoying, it's harmful. All right, Mrs. C, the lady referred to, sympathizing with those mothers whose circumstances precluded their incurring the expenses of £1,500, which was the sum paid by herself, pleaded the cause of those afflicted and destitute outcasts of society until Mr. T entered into her feelings with commiseration and decided with her on the necessity and practicability of having a charitable institution for the deaf and dumb children of the poor. Braidwood's nephew, Joseph Watson, offered himself as tutor and eventually became headmaster. He wrote on the education of the deaf and dumb in 1809. The Institute's name and location changed more than once, and for most of the 19th century it occupied a purpose-built boarding school on the Old Kent Road, Southwark, in inner London. It moved to the seaside at Margate, where it was known as the Royal School for Deaf Children. Margate, finally closing in 2015. Holy cow, that was recently. The Elementary Education, Blind and Deaf Children Act of 1893 set the compulsory age for the admission of deaf children in boarding schools at 7 years old, and the leaving age at 16. This was at odds with the compulsory age of admission for both hearing and blind children at 5 years old, and a school leaving age of 14 for hearing children. In 1937, a new law lowered the age of admission of children attending schools for the deaf from 7 years to 5 years. I think I know why. Because they thought they were stupid. Yeah, so they thought they were behind developmentally, and so they encouraged them to go later. I'm guessing, and then they eventually figured out that they're not behind developmentally, they just can't hear. Like, okay. In the mid-1960s, I almost said 1600s, and that would be embarrassing. Okay. In the mid-1960s, the Inner London Education Authority set up 2 primary schools for deaf children, Frank Barnes School in North London and Grove School in South London. They also opened Oak Lodge Secondary School in Wandsworth, South London, which was one of a few state boarding schools. British Sign Language was recognized in 2003. Holy cow, that's late. Really? 2003. I feel so bad for deaf people back in the day. Like, it was so hard to do anything because there was nothing. There were no resources for them. Like, it's so frustrating because so many people with disabilities are incredibly intelligent and they bring so much into this world. So much richness and life and interest and learning, and putting them to the side like this and being like, you're not important, it hurts my heart. It really does. And it makes me so sad. And just absolutely heartbroken. I understand the philosophies that they need, and I have heard other disabled people, indeed, even saying that they don't always like going to special schools because they're not preparing them for life necessarily, but I think in the case of deaf people that they are preparing them for life. First of all, you can't communicate. If you can't communicate, you can't learn. Yeah? If you want to learn to read and write, you need somebody you can communicate with. It doesn't matter if it's oral or not, but you need to be able to communicate. And so if you start out with sign language and then learn to read and write, and you're definitely got a huge advantage over the other, that you had before, I mean. And then if later on you can learn to speak, so you can communicate better with hearing people who don't know sign language, or you can write things down and exchange notes, then that is a huge advantage. So then you can do business over correspondence, yeah? And still be a reasonably good business person even though you can't hear. So, I don't know, it seems so unfair. I'm really glad that there are institutions that will teach you these skills, but I feel like it's sad that it's necessary that we are like pushing our deaf community into a corner and being like, here, you go over there, you're not important, And they did for so long. And it wasn't until very recently that they even recognized British Sign Language as a legitimate language. Are you kidding me? I can't even fathom that. Like, no, they're not speaking. What? Yes, they are. Like, what the heck? And then, like, having them start school later than most people because they thought they were stupid. Like, I'm just assuming that's the reason, but it probably is. Let's be honest. It just makes me so sad. I'm really glad that they, at this point in 1800, they were having some success with teaching the deaf children and teaching them to speak. And even though that's not necessarily like the first priority of a deaf school, like in my opinion should be, however, it's not a bad skill to have, yes? And I do appreciate that that is important for them to learn in order to get around in the hearing world, yeah? Anyways, if you have any information about the deaf community, please put it in the comments below. I am very interested. And make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.